You talked about this earlier too, or you briefly touched on it, but people always say, "Oh, Mike, you make such good picks," referring to all the companies that you've been at, right? Like obviously you go to Salesforce, they whatever 15x, right? Square 18x, DoorDash 100 plus x, I think, right? Like just in terms of their valuation from when you joined to now, I think, and I tell people like, if you're gonna work in tech, like it's extra important to pick the right companies because there's all the upside is in the equity. And it's like when you're buying stocks for your portfolio, you're going to do like research and due diligence. And sometimes people spend a lot of time on that. When you're picking a tech company to work for, you're not just paying with your money, you're actually paying with your time, which is like even more valuable because it could be 2, 3, 4 years of your life, or sometimes even longer, like in your case, right? And so what is there like a method, or is there like a, method to the madness, or like do you have a framework or a certain
Yeah,
criteria that you use?
I do have I wouldn't call it so official like a framework, but
Your Monte Carlo simulations, maybe? No.
that's anytime you're doing modeling, you should Monte Carlo it. But there are some criteria I look for in terms of the company and the industry. If I were to put it simply, I like companies that could potentially turn into a verb. Right? Like if I were to use that as an example, when you Google something, it has the potential. Like obviously, when Google first going against Yahoo, nobody thought, oh, they had a chance, but the market size was so enormous that even a small percentage gain could mean a huge windfall for enterprise value of the firm.
Yeah.
So Salesforce obviously was in a space where like they were the pioneer in changing a software that was installed on site in servers, whereas it's like, no, you rent the software, right? They're pioneers in SaaS, right? And if you just think about not just CRM, but just SaaS in general, it's a huge market globally.
Yeah.
And Salesforce basically not only created that market, but took share from legacy competition like Oracle and SAP. And eventually everybody started to say this is the new path. And now they compete in the same space. But I always like the concept of a company being able to, does the market justify something for it to be good, like, turn into a verb?
Yeah.
Square from payment processing was also really innovative in basically changing the industry norms, taking payments. When I thought, believe me, enough people around me dissuaded me or tried to convince me that I should not leave Square to go join DoorDash.
Mm.
Right? People knew like, oh, you're managing Caviar, like how Caviar is performing. Why would you want to go there? But when I obviously, I don't want to just call it food delivery. It's because it's more of solving for local logistics than anything. On demand logistics, and that's the problem that they're solving. Food delivery kind of is the starting point because it's the most habitual thing. But again, when you think about the core of what a company or an industry is trying to achieve, you think about the scale which it can deliver. And again, a lot of players all over the world, but globally, local logistics been happening for years and decades. And, there's always been somebody delivering something to somebody so it's like, how do you crack the nut in doing it better, doing it more with leverage and scale? So I've always looked for that because I always feel like, well, it's much harder for a company to own majority of share in any industry versus a company that can carve out a healthy amount of share in an enormous market. So I've been getting pings from CFO positions, and the recruiter or the head of the talent, tries to say, hey, we're trying to revolutionize this industry or this area. And sometimes I'm like, well, even if you own the entire
Yeah.
market,
Still
it's
small.
not worth very much.
And you're not going to own the entire market, probably.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of like the criteria I look for. I look for companies that are doing something innovative in a very large market. That does it have a chance of gaining a healthy amount of share in a market that's going to grow?
And I think the other thing I noticed too is like, when you join these three companies, in a way, I mean, they were still relatively early, but they all have product market fit already, right? So you're not like joining like a C stage startup that's just an idea, which would be extremely risky. But this is like, hey, they have a product, people like it, and now it's just a matter of like working out a lot of the kinks and also like go to market and scaling that and getting it into the hands of as many people as possible.
Yeah, I think my bread and butter has been you get to a point where proof of concept is met. You're now starting to scale. How do you put gas on that speed? And I think when I joined Square and when I joined DoorDash, it was early in that process. It was before we were trying to scale. We were trying to get our ducks in a row so that we could scale. And I think that removes a lot of the what I would call existential risk of a seed or A, right? It's not just you're way beyond just a concept and an idea. Now you actually have something that you're starting to ship.
Yeah.
Right? You're iterating and shipping. So
I feel like that's actually, in my opinion, I mean, there's no right or wrong here, but in my opinion, I was like, that's kind of the sweet spot on that risk reward curve because sure, you can be the employee number three at the next Airbnb. Realistically, for every person that did that, there's like 1,000 people who join a company that ended up being worthless at that stage, right?
yeah,
And so,
Yeah, and I think Sam also functionally, if your experience is in a certain like nobody hires their fifth employee a finance guy. And I actually have investments in small investments in small companies and they ask when should you hire a first finance person? I'm like not for a while. Like there's no need to have a finance lead early in, right? You need good engineers. You need to, create the product first or the service, right? So I think functionally being where we are and the experience we bring, I think a lot of times the earliest you can join, unless you're starting it yourself,
yeah,
is that Series B, C. That's probably the earliest you could join or you should join.
yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point.